My name is Joshua, and I am the Tribune. One of the most exciting things when working with God is seeing Him use an unusual situation to teach you a very unique principle, and then bring you an assignment soon after that looks like it has nothing to do with the past situation that He used to teach you this principle, but that principle totally parallels, and you can transfer it over to this new assignment and be very effective with Him. Now, today, God has ordered me to discuss a principle that is very hard to transfer over because it necessitates balance, an unusual level of balance and self-control. This is the concept of aligning your imaginations with God's imagination. This is very difficult because it's impossible to align your imagination completely with God's imagination because it's so vast. So, first, we have to realize the enemy attacks you so much in your mind and tries to commandeer your imagination because it's very powerful. God gave us our imagination for a reason, and we're going to discuss why. But if you realize that because the enemy attacks something so hard, it really means that it's valuable to you if you use it correctly. So Satan's agenda is to make sure you do not use your imagination correctly. He wants you to use it against yourself, number one, or in a way that pleasures you, but you don't have any benefit with God. So today, God wants to teach you how He expects you to use your imagination with Him. But the first thing we have to understand is that we cannot align with God's imagination perfectly. So this comes in steps, this process, because you have to have a certain amount of balance in order to use your imagination properly for it to totally benefit you. So the purpose of our imagination is to give us fuel to do God's purpose. That's really what it's for. So first, in order to do this and actually step into this, we have to make sure that we can hear God. If we cannot hear God, then we cannot know where to channel our imagination and put it towards for God's purpose. Because in order to do that, we need to know what God is saying and what He expects of us and what He's thinking of and what He's talking to us about and what step we are on that He expects us to advance on. So that's the first thing. We have to hear God. It's really important. The second thing is, while you're trying to hear God, you can do this at the same time. While you're trying to hear God, you can actually practice subjugating your imagination to yourself. You have to be in control of your imagination. You cannot let your imagination go rampant where you just think of anything and you just get used to just imagining so many different things because those things don't end anywhere. There's no end for those things. You're just entertaining yourself. And this is the problem with doing that. So what you first have to do is make sure you control what you think about. That's what the first goal is. Because if you can start controlling what you think about every day and throughout the day, and managing that energy and that mind space while you're trying to learn God's voice and you're hearing God, then by the time you hear God, you can actually use your imagination with so much power, and it will help you advance in God's purpose at a faster and more effective pace. So after you subjugate your imagination to yourself and you can control what you think about, then after that you have to hear God. After you hear God, you take what God says to you of whatever He's trying to speak to you about to get you to do or to get you to learn or to learn about His character or to teach you about yourself. You need to then channel those imaginations that you have and your mind energy towards whatever He's talking about. Now, this is where it gets tricky because you cannot have the highest level imagination because God's imagination is so past where we can even scrape the surface of. We can't tap into that completely. So what we have to do is we have to make sure we think our highest thought and have our highest imagination that pertains to what God is speaking to us about. And when we do that, we have to translate that power into action steps. Because if your imagination doesn't translate into action steps based on what God is speaking to you about, then you are just doing nothing. You're just daydreaming. This is what we do not want. So people who tell you that that your imagination can only be used to pleasure you, they're lying to you. And this is also a satanic attack to get you to have imaginations that are not aligned with God's purpose for your life, so that because he knows that wherever your imaginations are pointed towards, you will be headed in that direction, whether it's just in your mind, which takes up time in the world, in your life, or even if those imaginations translate into action steps. He can actually give you imagination, Satan can, that will actually lead you stepping in the wrong direction in your real life. So when God speaks to you and he gives you, say, some kind of instruction, or he's having a conversation with you, it's important to imagine the highest thought you can on that topic. And you should imagine it so that it excites you, because God will give you the ability to use your imagination and tap into his imagination in certain parts of his imagination so that you can see what he's thinking about for that topic and what the end of that topic would be. Now, it's very crucial to understand that God will always exceed what your imaginations are. You cannot have an imagination that is bigger than God's imagination. So you should feel very safe of having your highest thought with what God is speaking to you about, and then working on that thing and using that excitement and that pleasure to motivate you to move forward. I'm going to give an example of this so you can understand what I really mean by this. Now, let's just say God's asking you to eat healthier and make sure your body is cleansed physically so that you're not unhealthy. Instead of just trying to eat healthier and just thinking about, I got to eat more vegetables, and I got to stop eating fast food, and I got to stop doing this and that. Instead of doing that, you should imagine why God is telling you that thing. Why is God telling you need to be more healthy? It's not some doom and gloom thing either, where it's like you're going to die and this and that. No, that's a negative imagination. That can actually benefit you, but if you dwell on that, it's not going to be profitable to you. You should partner that with saying, okay, if God's telling me that I need to eat healthier, and God's telling me that I need to live longer and take care of my body, it's because he has a plan for my life. And that plan necessitates that I need to be healthy so that I can be effective in what God's asking me to do on the earth. So then you start asking God, okay, God, what are you thinking about pertaining to me and my purpose that you need me to be healthy? And then he will start speaking to you on that matter, because he knows that if he tells you why he wants you to be healthy, it'll be very easy for you to stay healthy in the moments where you're really about to binge on some kind of fast food or unhealthy snacks, and you're just going to just eat away because you don't understand what God's purpose is for telling you that. So in the moment where you're getting weak, you can have the imagination of what you're going to look like or how you're going to feel when you're doing God's purpose, and you're going to be effective in that purpose because of your health, because of the steps you're doing right now and taking care of your body. This is a great example about using your imagination in order to take the steps and have it motivate you to fulfill the purpose and follow the instruction that God's asking you to complete. Now, it's very, very crucial to not be afraid to imagine big. Because when you're imagining big pertaining to God's work, He will always make sure that He outdoes you. And when God speaks something to you, He wants you to come as high as you can up to His level. So He will allow you to imagine the highest you possibly can and then show you that, hey, I can do more than that through you. This comes in your preparation. When you're preparing God's work and you're preparing His blueprints, you will see God outdo you through yourself. And this is done through you having imaginations and actually taking your imagination that He's giving you and using that as fuel, and Him saying, I have more in that area for you. I have more to prepare through you than even what you can imagine and think about. This is how you start learning God's character, and you start learning this creative side of God. This is specifically for people who are looking to create with God, or to even better themselves and just even be a stronger person. Because you can use this in many different areas. It's not just creativity. You can use this in spiritual warfare. If an enemy comes against me and God's saying, I need you to fight this enemy. I need you to battle in the Spirit with me and my power. Then the first thing I'm thinking of is, what are the spoils on the other end of this battle? What do I gain from fighting this enemy? This is another time where imaginations play in. Because if God told you to fight this enemy, and then you are actually thinking, God, what do you imagine on the other side of this battle for me? And how is my relationship with you going to grow from conquering this enemy? How is my purpose going to advance? Then it gives me more power to come against that enemy and more strength, because I see what's on the other side of it. It doesn't matter if my imagination isn't perfect. What matters is that it's aligned with what God is asking me to do. And then conquering that enemy, on the other end, God will always give me more than my imagination could even fathom. It also works when He is telling you something and you're imagining what will happen if you don't do it. This is a big key about imaginations too with God, is that you can actually imagine, wow, if I don't do this step that you're asking me to do, and I'm not going in this direction that you're saying that you want me to advance in, then what are the consequences for that? This is another way that I really use imaginations in a godly way to motivate myself to move forward in Him, is I imagine my consequences. Now, I don't overindulge in those imaginations, because then you start operating in absolute fear, and that's not what He wants. And it's very important to understand that in this side of it, when you're looking at the consequence side and you're imagining these consequences, that if you don't do this step, what will follow that for me that I don't want? Anytime you start getting depressed or you start falling into a pit of despair because of these imaginations, it is not of God. You need to come out of it and go to the other side, which is He's saying, what will I actually do in your life that's beautiful if you do follow the step? You need to go over in that area then. But this is how you use your imagination from God that He gave you to advance His purpose. He wants you to actually not be realistic all the time. He wants you to dream. This is part of imaginations, but it has to be done with the intent of using it as fuel for action steps. This is very important. This principle will make it so that you're absolutely undefeated in moving forward with God. You cannot be conquered you will be the conqueror, and more than a conqueror, if you use this gift of your imagination in whatever area he's speaking on. This is extremely valuable. Now, I have a disclaimer, because each powerful gift has a side to it that if you don't adhere to the rules, then it will be used as a weapon against you. It's very important to understand that you can have a righteous and good imagination that actually is in line with what God was speaking to you about in the past. But if you continue to get stuck in that imagination and you get lost in that, even after let's say you do the action steps through it, you do it correctly, you use it as fuel, but then you can't get out of it. And now he's moved over here to something totally different, but you're still stuck on imagining something that actually he's moved on from. This is when he becomes very displeased, and you actually start damaging your walk with God. Because the disclaimer is, you have to be able to pivot and move in this whenever he moves. If he's talking about food, like in the example I just used, then you can use that health situation and use your imaginations to help you advance in that area. But once he switches to, say, doing blueprints for a building or designing anything or writing or singing or anything, then you need to transfer it over. You need to stop imagining about that and move over to where he is and immediately recalibrate your imaginings to fit where he's asking you to move in. This is very important because he pivots, he moves, and you cannot predict where he's going to move next. So it's important to be able to control and subjugate your imaginations. That's where that comes in, because you're not stuck on one thing. You don't get lost. You're able to pivot over here and say, okay, God, you're talking about this. Now, what do I need to imagine that connects with your imagination that can help me do action steps in this area now? Okay, you're done with that. Now you're over here. Then let's go here now. It's important to balance your imaginations with your real life steps too. You cannot imagine so much in that area that you can't think about what you practically need to do to advance his agenda. That's another piece of it. You can have a pencil in front of you. You're drawing blueprints for a palace, but you're imagining so much about walking through the palace, and you're so lost in that vision that you never actually start drawing anything. That's what we don't want. What we want is for you to feed on your imagination with God that aligns to his purpose and his steps. Just enough for you to have enough energy and motivation to think bigger in real life than you could if you weren't imagining and you didn't have a vision of what God is asking you to think about. And that's what your imaginations are for. It's so that you can think higher than your natural situation. This is what our imaginations are for. Because what you need to understand is that God will actually ask you to prepare things before you're in the situation that looks like, oh, it's obvious that he's preparing this. It makes sense that she would be working on this with God because look at her surroundings. He will ask you to prepare things in places that look opposite of what you're preparing with him, which means you will have to connect to a place in your imagination with God that takes you as close to that place in reality as you can, so you can start pulling it out of your imagination and pulling pieces out and pulling the feeling that you have and preparing real things that God can use for his glory on the earth. Physical things. This is what our imagination's for. So for the people who are trying to stop imagining and they think they're too in their own mind, they're just imagining everything, maybe it's not that it's wrong for you to have a vivid imagination. The problem is that you are not translating that imagination to anything that God is talking about. This is the problem. In fact, I believe he will give you imaginations even when you can't control them and you haven't subjugated them, to give you clues about what he wants to speak to you about. This is another piece of it. We have to pay attention to what we're imagining, because you can look at your imaginations and things that you daydream about even when you're not even hearing God. You can look at those things and say, that's something that could be a God thing. And you know when it's a God thing. Because it's clean and it's beyond anything that you can ever, you think that you can do in your real life. I'm not talking about pornographic fantasies and any kind of filthy thing like that, or any kind of wicked imaginations. Those are obviously not God imaginations. It could be something from your childhood, something that it just keeps coming to you in your imagination of your childhood, like a character that you just loved his outfit, or a scene that you loved in a movie as a child when you were a kid. If you find yourself marinating on something like that and you keep slipping into it, and it's clean and it gives you a feeling that is wonderful and beautiful, like nostalgia or something like that, then maybe it's God trying to guide you and say, listen, if you connect with me, I have something for you that will make you feel like it will connect to that place. So for people who are trying to control their imaginations and they don't understand that it's good to have a vivid imagination, it just has to be used as fuel, then these are the steps that you take to practice. Now, I'm going to go over this one more time because it's so important. The first thing you have to do is you have to hear God. You have to hear God, because if you can't hear God, you're not going to know what you should imagine, because you don't know what he's talking about. And if you don't know what he's talking about, then there's nothing to put into action with him, because you're oblivious of what he's saying. That's the first thing you need. Second thing is you need to subjugate your imaginations first to yourself. You need to control your thinking. You need to know how to control yourself. And you can do these two. You can learn those two things at the same time. The next thing is you need to, after he speaks to you, you need to make sure that you think your highest thought pertaining to that thing of the future. Your highest, most wonderful thought. Because the most you can think about doesn't even come close to what he's actually thinking. And you're going to need every kind of imagination with him that you possibly can, your highest level, so that you can start pulling out of that imagination, pulling the feeling of that imagination out, so that you can actually prepare real things that God wants to do on the earth. And then you have to manage it and balance it so that you are not having imaginations that are of God and you're lost in them, to where you don't do anything in the natural that will move you forward in that preparation for that specific area in your life and your purpose. This is the step. These are all the steps. And I hope this gives you freedom and joy and helps you put into focus what God's idea was when He gave you a brilliant imagination. Hail Jehovah.